Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the podcast episode of Evidence Matters with Bowie and Davis. I am Jerry Bowie. I am the Senior Vice President of Digital Forensics at Purpose Legal.
And I'm Steve Davis, and I'm a VP in Forensics and Investigations for Purpose Legal.
Thanks, Steve. We are the co-hosts of this new podcast series, and we will, on occasion, have other digital forensics experts or stakeholders, a variety of guests that will help make this discussion more colorful. But the goal is to tackle the digital forensics issues du jour. And the ones that I find coming up time and time again, Steve, is the issue around mobile device collections. I thought I'd ask you, since you interface a lot with clients and get feedback from them about mobile collections and how well they go or how badly they go, which is very often the case these days. And we'll get into the reasons why. But, you know, after a collection is performed, what is the most common reason that you see from your seat why mobile collections go poorly?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this last night and this morning, and we were just chatting off camera about, trips to Italy and Greece. My family and I took one year or so ago, and, I've been to Australia, I've been to Africa, I've been to France and England, but I hadn't been to Greece and Italy. So as a human, we kind of try to create expectations for what something's going to be like. And so we borrow, either we get online and we Google and look at things, or we read magazines if we're old school, or we pull from our frame of reference. So for me, I pull from other trips I took to think about it. And I analogize that with, the normal thing a lot of people have done historically is get a bit by bit forensic image of a computer. So when phones and mobile devices started becoming more normative in terms of e-discovery, I think people borrowed from their experiences, much like I did on vacation. They did, thinking about how a computer collection and parsing went compared to mobile device. And I think that right there creates a fracture because they're very disparate in different things. And I think technologically, this at its heart, because we're not dealing with a simple linear operating system with loose files, but rather we're dealing with, in many occasions, a SQLite database, and we have to mount data and then parse or normalize and extract out information from like an organic database, which is far different from doing a bit by bit image where it's pretty easy to get access to certain data.
Yeah, I think that gets to the root of the word forensic and how a collection through the mobile device isn't technically forensic because it's not bit for bit. It's not a bit stream that is ultimately under the forensic examiner's control. It is really under the device carrier's control. And if you talk about layering the different levels of control, you alluded to it, is all the permutations that could happen on a logical collection involving the device itself, the OS, the operating system of the device. So with iPhones, it's iOS. With Pixels and Samsung Galaxies, it's going to be Android provided by Google. And then all of the layers of applications on top of it. And we're primarily interested in messaging apps, and those have their own issues or challenges as well. So when you stack the device plus the OS plus the application of interest, there's a lot of navigating we need to do in order to get a defensible collection. A forensically defensible collection is not necessarily a physical forensic collection by definition, but it's what the industry deems as best practice in terms of our approach. And you also alluded to the fact that that best practice basically changes on a day-to-day basis. So Googling information is perfectly valid, but more so reaching out to your network. You and I have vast networks that we could tap into in order to learn or evolve our best practices on a day-to-day basis. So being tapped into the community makes a big difference, right, Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it takes a village when it comes to, and that's the beauty of forensics. I think in the forensics, which is very scientific, and I always love that part of it, that it's not just yapping about things, but it's actually empirically underwriting information. And I think you're exactly right. It's not a place where you need to be embarrassed because things are changing, including APIs and access and encryption day by day. and tools change and their ability to access information and parse it in a way that we can then put it into a platform for humans to review. I think the flashing red light, the sore thumb, the red flag that comes to my mind is this is an area where you've got to lay a predicate. You've got to have communications with the stakeholders, with the end users, with the custodians, with the law firms or in-house counsel, dealing with what expectations should be, and then all these variables and parameters that you're talking about. And I think if, at our company, we're pretty rigid about having kind of a series of kickoff calls. One is kind of a scoping call that really discussed about what we're trying to get to, right? It's my wife asking me, how long does it take to get there? And I ask her where we're going. Like, once you know where you're going, then you can map it out, whether it's on, Maps Go 30 years ago, or now it's on Waze or Google Maps or whatever. Now you have a pretty good idea of what it's going to take to get there. Satellite overlay tells you. Well, the same thing's true in forensics. Once we know more, and once we have actually gathered information about what you're after, because I think you'd agree, Jerry, hopefully, that when we talk to someone and we find out it's communication centric, and even take it beyond that and say it's inherent native iMessage app we're getting, that's probably a different mountain to climb than if you're dealing with Telegram and Discord and WeChat and Viber and things like that.
Yeah, and this is where I think our clients tend to get overwhelmed, because already right there, you're scratching the surface around the nuances of the collection. And that's just one of many, many things to consider. And so while we do have these scoping calls, I think that, clients tend to get quickly overwhelmed with the information. And so being able to dissect that information in a way that's targeted for their purposes, right? We have the technical information that we could convey, but if we have the experience and the professional context, then we can really customize or tailor the information delivery for what their needs are. Because if we gave them the full data dump on everything that could go wrong, all of the decision trees that, in a decision flow diagram that they might have to consider, I think that gets overwhelming. So, I think that the human interaction, bolstered by what we do at Purpose with our documentation by way of questionnaires, and setting those expectations, gives them some ability to make decisions and to make them confidently based on what we're asking them to decide on, right? Because they certainly don't want to decide on something that they're unsure about. And that's where we come in and lend our experience and give them a comfort level. That is ultimately what white glove treatment ultimately applies to. It's that bedside manner and being able to handle discussions with counsel, but also at the end of the day with the custodians, who they themselves are very nervous about the mobile devices, especially in not a growing, but a very common bring your own device type scenario, where they're using their personal devices for work-related communications, and that commingling of data can be very problematic. I don't know how you prefer to handle those conversations, Steve, but I know that that's, as a company, what we really emphasize. And so getting the right people talking the right language to the stakeholders and the custodians and all the parties involved really make things go smoother.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up a lot of great and valid points. The first one being that getting access to information kind of opens up a Pandora's box, right? And we have the potential to infiltrate and get access to information that's privatized. And so I think, for us, where some of the technical jargon and language can overwhelm people, I think people are kind of reliant on our experiences and our testing, which is why we do so much testing internally on the latest and greatest and what platforms are available to access both Android and iOS. And then, do you get the totality of all the information out there? Or are there now methodologies that allow you to just get targeted data? And even if you can do it within a black box and only promote data that's relevant to the matter or the dispute at hand, I think that's gigantic. But as I always say, I think only in about 100% of the cases is privacy a concern. And you're right. Nowadays, we've kind of seen a transition of data that used to be housed on servers and maybe desktops and then more recently laptops, I would take it a step beyond that and say, what we're seeing is mobile devices from when we're doing communication centric analyses house your email, although it's not readily accessible necessarily on the actual physical device, but it is synced there. Then we also have the textual communications that occur on a whole variety of third party apps as well as inherent apps. And then we also have collaboration platforms. So all those are fertile areas for us to get access to. But I think our ability to be more finite and go in and actually get what's relevant and not just do a data grab is gigantic. And maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of today versus 5 or 10 years ago, that ability to get to information more readily.
Yeah, I think that we are still in the world of collect in order to preserve when it comes to mobile devices. There is no kind of preservation in place switch that you can flip that's occurring more readily on enterprise controlled data sources. But even if they are corporate issued devices and you have MDM installed on there, there's very little that you can actually preserve in place. So collect to preserve is still definitely the mode that we operate in. And really, you have to contemplate at the onset of any collection or any kind of mobile device forensics is 3 pathways. And sometimes those occur simultaneously. Sometimes you're afforded with just one of those workflows. But really, the 3 involve preservation. That's usually like fundamental, and how you preserve, right? Do you want to do a targeted preservation or a much fuller or comprehensive full file system preservation? It's like, how do you want to cover your bases when it comes to preservation? Number 2, is you alluded to this, is what do you extract from that preservation image? So if this is an ESI, e-discovery collection workflow, which is very kind of routine, then you can be a little bit more targeted and not worry about the full-blown preservation piece. See how they interplay there? But if you also require, for example, the recovery of deleted items, would say you have a forensic investigation analysis that's involved there. You're looking at the artifacts. I like to think about it in terms of, okay, e-discovery is more about what the custodian says, right, or writes or composes, and forensic analysis is more about what the custodian does. It's more about the behavior. So if you're looking for what they say or how they behave, you might need a much more fulsome preservation as a basis to accomplish those goals, right? So if it's only e-discovery, then you could be much more targeted. But if you want to do e-discovery plus forensic analysis and you're under threat of things potentially being deleted and you want to be much more fulsome, then, that dictates a full file system collection. So that is kind of, yeah.
When you run into that full file system collection, and I know, there's consequences to that, right? And especially from a standpoint of herding cats and getting custodians to turn over. First of all, this is their security blanket. This is their favorite toy as a toddler, whatever. Their phone feels differently than their desktop and laptop do. And so when they look at it, they're like, hey, you can't have access to my phone. And if I do give you my phone, you can have it for a hot minute and do your work. But I think the implication that is that when we have to do a full file system, it can take literally days sometimes, or at least up to a day to do that collection, which is problematic for people that are used to having that in their grubby little fist and they don't want to let go of it.
Yeah, the newer phones are 2 terabytes, Steve, 2 terabytes in storage capacity nowadays. And if they're full, they will take days. Right. And so I think that the privacy issue is important. And you just mentioned it. Disruption is also a key consideration. If they have to send their phone in, or if we have to arrive on site, is it going to involve taking away an entire day's worth of productivity? It could. But again, that's the trade-off, right? And so those are important considerations. And, the nuances and the variables are plentiful. So I want to take a moment, Steve, shifting gears and talk about the team or the village. It takes a village, because a solo forensic practitioner might be very, very good at one thing, but only that one thing. The specialties can vary. And so depending on what you're looking for on a device, especially as the intersection point to more data that you want to discover and analyze and investigate, it requires a team that might be specializing in, Android versus iOS at a very high level. The intersection point of messaging and all the different messaging apps. Are you finding artifacts around nefarious behavior that you need to get collections from the cloud separately? And so I think that from the forensic analysis standpoint, ultimately the expert testimony, this is where the team matters above and beyond just e-discovery type of workflows. If you want to do forensic analysis and you ultimately want to defend your methodologies, your preservation methodologies, I think the team of experts who can testify and have experience in the hot seat like you and I do, Steve, really matters.
Yeah, I think that's a gigantic point. And I think, you mentioned earlier, and I think it's right on point, that even the smartest attorneys that are far brighter than me, they don't get some of the technological gobbledygook. They don't understand a lot of the idiosyncrasies that we deal with. And so what we really need to do is not regurgitate everything and educate them so much, because I don't think they want to know that. What they need to know is that we have the experience to do it, and that we have a process and a procedure and the human element that can do that. And I think it's rinse repeat, as I call it. Like your experience testifying and mine testifying, everyone knows you're a scarecrow and they're trying to knock you off your perch, right? And they're going to try to find any weakness they can. So we know it's got to be programmatic, got to be procedural, and it's got to go by a process that we've used before and that we can rely on. And I think once you do that, you kind of scare them off from tackling process and procedure and get them more worried about facts and law. And that's what we really want. And what I always say is what we are is we're scientists, we're data scientists. And it's not, we're not advocates and we're not taking positions. All we do is we see black and white. We see this is information available and we let other people draw conclusions, not necessarily editorialize. But it's very important. And I think that is the beauty of kind of the teamwork approach when you have people and you can involve data solutions, people that do nothing but manage data. I mean, you think about information coming off a phone. Yeah, there's loose files, but there's a ton of textual communication. So when you talk about any of our communications with one of our kids, are we going to get ad infinitum, everything under the sun for the last 20 years? Are we going to get the last month? Are we going to get 20 lines above and below? I mean, there are contextual analysis you do. I mean, those are issues that are also important because we're dealing with kind of an elusive amount of data. Since it can go forever and ever, amen, we've got to figure out how to represent that in an intelligent way. So it's got to be something that you've already planned. And I think what we've discussed here in the first 15 minutes or so is this importance of communication with the stakeholders, be they corporate representatives, be they underlying custodians, or be they outside counsel. We've got to communicate with them and explain the procedure, the process, and what the end game. And I'll tell you, every time I've done that, and I imagine you as well, the angst, over the process drops dramatically.
Yeah, I agree. And I think where we're effective is that as experts, our own reputation is at stake. So we're invested, right? We have been under the hot seat. We have had methodologies challenged. So we know how to shore up those gaps. We can see around the corners. And so if there is any kind of potential deficiency in the upfront preservation step, we see it. And we make sure our chain of custody is intact. We make sure that we're using best practices. We make sure we document, and more importantly, communicate all of those risks to the client so they have a little bit of a preview of what could be happening down the road. Sometimes there's trade-offs that you just have to accept, but it's better to be prepared because we're looking out for ourselves at the same time that we're looking out for the client. We're looking out for the team as well, in-house at the service provider, trying to make make us better at the end of the day, because the feedback we get while, on the stand, any of those gaps or shortcomings can be shared with the team. And it's a real life story that they can understand. And they learn that, hey, if I want to follow this career path, I want to, shore up my capabilities and get real disciplined around what I do. And that helps us evolve from a standard order taker to real experts. And so I think that's what we have to ultimately offer at the end of the day is the strength of the team, but also the expert consulting that we can provide to our clients, which matter. So it's process and people, and of course the technology, which we have, plentiful, a really robust toolbox to help solve problems.
Yeah, you mentioned something earlier I wanted to kind of follow up on, which is the notion that data that's housed inside a database can be ephemeral or transient and it can leave, right? It can leave through human interaction and deletion. It can leave like LIFO FIFO, first in and accounting and pushed out the door as additional data gets there. And I know we run into that. I always make the joke about like if you've got a 18-year-old daughter and she's a serial user to a phone, her data is going to be more transient than it's going to be with the old gray mare like me that doesn't use it as much and push it out. So when you have obviously when you have deletion issues, I know there's more advanced techniques like full file system extracts to get to, but if you can't find data that's been deleted, um, what are your thoughts about are there other methodologies to get back to that data? Because I think one of the disconnects I hear is when someone says, we want you to do this project and we do it and we provide to them the outcomes and the results. And they're like, it's not here. And so how do you get to that? And the answer may be a full file system, but what if it's truly been deleted and it's not recoverable from that source? Are there other ways to get to it?
Yeah, you can kind of back into it. You might not be able to recover the information, but at least you can identify the gaps. And identifying the gaps is important, the absence of information, and see if it coincides with anything else that might, indicate nefarious intent or corrupt intent. And so that matters too, is like, sometimes you're looking for a adverse inference, which can be a big deal when it comes to spoliation type claims. And so identifying those gaps is important too. Why an entire day's worth of geolocation information is missing, for example,
Mm-hmm.
is one way. Why there's a big gap in Google searching and web browsing history. Was there any kind of intentional deletion there? And sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. It could be machine related, or more so today, AI related, because AI is also messing with a lot of metadata and information. So, you don't automatically jump to conclusions, but you look at the surrounding information to try to understand the context. They might have been on maternity leave. That's why you don't have any, you might have a gap, or parental leave rather, which is why it could explain a gap. So, having kind of that thought process and the ability to look at the constellation of artifacts that would give you the right context is important. If you're just analyzing based on a single artifact, you're more prone to making mistakes. And some quote unquote experts are doing out there and not spending the time. And so that's
Yeah.
where bouncing off these findings with other team members also really helps too. And that's where it further takes a village.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges in our business is especially probably more for you than me, is you've got back to back to back to back analyses, investigations, collections that you deal with, and at the same time, this whole notion of having a process that is good as of today, not yesterday, means you've got to do a lot of testing. You've got to empirically underwrite alternative solutions, new software programs, latest
That's right.
beta versions that have been released. And so it's kind of one hand you're out there breaking, rocks in the prison yard. And on the other hand, you also need to underwrite and be a science and a scientist in a enclosed environment where you can do testing with a control group and prove up what the real delta or difference is with a given tool or the latest version of a tool or a peculiar app that we're dealing with to see how it works. And that's got to be a conundrum and a difficulty for kind of you and the team.
Yeah, yeah, it is, but it's fun. It's challenging.
Right.
It keeps our job interesting. And I attend a lot of conferences, do a lot of thought leadership, and that's really a way to get the information out there. And so we can start to show our latest R&D results and get everyone educated and informed about the latest forensic issues. And so that's another part of the equation as well is improving our own skills, improving the team skills, making sure we communicate and document, follow best practices, but also share the latest and greatest with the community. And so that whole ecosystem of activities is important. We emphasize that across the board at Purpose Legal.
And I think the circle of life, as you mentioned, that is once you do that and you get that feedback and then you utilize that feedback, that's that very predicate meeting, the kickoff meeting. We then are empowered to go into those meetings and be able to talk about what's the latest and greatest. Have you heard of this product? Does it work this way? Should we do a full file system? Is an advanced logical good enough? I think that very feedback you're talking about that you guys are doing a lot of the empirical testing on nonstop then feeds into the communication style for all of us on kickoff calls and introductory calls where people are, can we do this? Well, we've learned through this feedback loop that you can or can't based on our experiences, not just on projects we've done, but also on the testing we're doing daily.
Yeah, it's definitely a virtuous life cycle for sure. And so that's what we're trying to get better at. We try to minimize mistakes. Mistakes do occur, but that's part of the learning process. And we like to be involved in fixing those issues and also communicating those fixes out to the broader community because a rising tide does lift all ships.
So when you think about this, we could talk for, 17 hours on this one subcomponent of the topic of mobile devices. Kind of what does this beg the issue for maybe the next conversation or a future conversation that we have? We've dealt with like these are some of the fear factor items you got to deal with up front when you communicate with attorneys, but then what does this lead to in terms of like next steps in your mind in terms of this whole discussion on mobile device data and how people can utilize that in the confines of a dispute, an investigation, or litigation?
So, Steve, I think that presents a very good segue to our next episode. Because collecting the data is one thing. How does the presentation of that data look like? And we do have a great team at Purpose called Data Solutions, and they are really good at interacting with us. We're on very frequent meetings, sharing the latest and greatest, and they're the ones that actually make the data that we collect understandable by reviewers and by the other stakeholders, and ultimately a problem-free production at the end of the day. So I want to perhaps highlight a team of ours, Steve, known as Data Solutions. Do you want to just give a quick preview of what that team does for us at
Yeah,
Purpose
I
Legal?
love that. So I think data solutions, these are the brainiacs that go in and they actually normalize the data and they make it consumable. So they're the ones that take the round peg and put it into the square hole and allow us across a whole variety of platforms. Because remember, there's, when you think about the EDRM and the life cycle of data across that, there are viewing platforms that allow laymen and practitioners to get in and kind of view information. And we're taking things and we're kind of unbundling them and then we're ingesting them into those platforms. So you got to normalize data. You got to ensure that things like emojis are being represented accurately. And that's what they do. They basically are the scientists that go in, take the raw data, apply their tools and techniques to it, and then get it into a fashion that people are allowed to consume it and make sense out of it. And I think that's gigantic. And I think as busy and as smart as they are, there's also these third-party platforms we have to deal with. And so I want to hear more from them about what are their challenges when they run into the variety of different viewing e-discovery platforms that exist. Are there challenges? Are they all uniform? And I think that would be a good rabbit hole to go down.
So if you enjoy these topics and they are of interest to you, if you subscribe to our podcast on any number of popular platforms, you will get insight and you'll see how we're able to work and collaborate with other internal teams at Purpose Legal and how we streamline that data pipeline to make your life easier at the end of the day.
Sounds great.
Thanks for joining us today, y'all, and give us a follow, and we'll see you on the next episode.